Hello. A bit of context before we start. This is based on a lecture I give on the first year module Reading English, which is one of our introductory modules on the English degree, designed to help students make sense of poetry and equip them with methodologies and techniques that they can use to make sense of this type of very complex language. And I want to start by what might seem quite a basic point, but sort of quite a fundamental one when thinking about form in poetry. It's the fact that poetry is governed from the first by traditions, by established patterns and fixed forms. What I mean is each writer must navigate a range of traditional long-standing forms when composing their verse, which they can either utilise or disregard, and their choices, even if they're negative ones, will dictate the content of their poems to quite a large extent, as these frameworks mould the poem itself, dictating the course that it will take before it's even been written. In the words of Raymond Williams, the question that we often ask ourselves, what did this author do to this form? Actually, it's more interesting to invert that and think about what did the form do to the author. But it's also true, however, that there is a degree of resistance to form, a preference for believing that unique inspiration or creativity is, if you like, the true essence of poetry. And the French philosopher Jacques Derrida summarises here the hostility that form-based criticism has often been subject to. He says that the relief and design of structures appears more clearly when content, which is the living energy of meaning, is neutralised, somewhat like the architecture of an uninhabited or deserted city reduced to its skeleton by some catastrophe. So what he's describing here is a sense that emphasising the form of poetry somehow renders it dead, skeletal, dry and lifeless. This kind of prejudice that the real life of poetry lies in the meaning it expresses. And the New York poet Peter Vareg echoes this idea in his own attack on formal analysis, associating form with hugging poetry to death, even inflicting rigor mortis upon it. Form then is often looked on with suspicion, as though it ignores the matters of real weight in poetry, or worse, renders living verse into a cold corpse to be clinically dissected. However, in spite of these reservations, studying the form of poetry is not a dry or lifeless exercise at all, and it can in fact be an invaluable means of understanding exactly how a poem functions. Once you're able to recognise the particular conventions that the poet is drawing on, or deliberately distorting, you will often be able to identify much of what is going on in the poem. It is the form, it's the interrelation of or even the tension between the parts, the patterns of lines and rhymes that in fact enables poems to convey what they do. Form dimension of content, but in many cases is what makes the content possible. As William Carlos Williams writes here, it is form that brings poetry to life. It's its operative element. In fact, an appreciation of form is really the starting point for any close analysis of a poem, as knowing the implicit rules a poem is following can at the very least give you some sense of how it's likely to organise itself, the types of relationship it will set up between its components, whether or not it chooses to follow all of the conventions that its chosen form implies. Even if it does alter its form, you will still need to know what that form is in order to comprehend the modifications it's carrying out. So, to show you exactly what we can do with form, and to introduce you to a range of different poetic forms and the different effects they imply, we're going to have a look at a few examples. So, you can see here a fairly representative sample of some of the most common poetic forms that you find in English, as these three poems I've got here take the respective forms of tercets, quatrains and couplets. And we'll start off by looking at the first two, Philip Larkin's Birth and Ben Jonson's To His First Son. So the quatrain is so called because it comprises 4 lines, usually rhyming A, B, A, B, although it's not unusual for the first and third lines to lack a rhyme, as they do here. The couplet is simply a pair of lines united by a common rhyme at their conclusion. And these two forms are really the basic building blocks, it might be said, of poetry in English. In fact, the A-B-A-B quatrain is known as the common metre, owing to its wide proliferation. A number of the longer or more elaborate forms, such as the sonnet or the ballad, are really constructed out of these more rudimentary forms. So, for instance, this sestain a 6-line stanza by Edward Taylor is in fact simply a quatrain concluding with a couplet. But the widespread nature of these forms doesn't mean that they lack interest for analysis or commentary. The couplet is, for instance, quite a versatile form. If it wasn't, it would hardly be able to achieve the widespread usage it has. So you compare Jonson's couplets to this stanza from a poem by Joanna Baillie, which is also comprised of couplets. You can see something of the flexibility here. There are important and immediate differences between the two. You'll notice that Jonson's lines are extremely regulated and measured, with each couplet containing a single sentence or a single statement. Baillie's couplets, conversely, are marked by enjambment, meaning that the sense of the line, its syntax or its grammar, exceeds the limit of the line itself. When speaking of Thy Little Cheek, then, the line in fact ends halfway through the full phrase. We have to wait for the next line before we find out what has caused the cheek to grow redder, the jingling keys that she describes. So Jonson is in fact using a form known as the closed couplet here, since each couplet is a kind of polished, complete unit in its own right, closed off from any other. In fact, he takes this to kind of quite interesting extremes in this poem. Such emphasis is placed on the self-containment, the completion of the couplets, that there is no sense of relationship or progression between them. In fact, if you wanted to, you could quite easily move them all around into a different sequence and the poem would remain just as intelligible. Jonson has refused, in other words, to give his couplets any obvious coherence or continuity outside their own boundaries. This is a significant choice, and it shows how form invariably has a meaning of its own. The form he's adopted, in effect, mirrors the bereavement that the poem is commemorating. The death of a child, particularly of a son, an intended heir, is likewise an event which is conclusive, which is closed off from any potential succession. It's a decisive end rather than a stage in a continuum. So the fragmentation of the poem into several self-contained units that don't follow one another is itself an aspect of the death and grief that the poem is recording. So the form that's been chosen here doesn't only reflect or complement the meaning of the poem, it actively constructs this aspect of its meaning. The poem would still be about grief, even if it were written as, say, a limerick, but the sense of conclusiveness that accompanies this stems entirely from the form, and the fact that all of those couplets are closed off from each other by the punctuation and the syntax. The more open, enjambment-filled couplets of Baillie have a sort of comparable effect. These likewise add to the meaning of the poem that deals with the relationship between mother and child, and between the child and the world, and the connections between them. Baillie conceives this as rich and enticing, something that calls the child to merge with it, causing it to shriek and smile in equal measure. Again, an awareness of the form being used in a particular poem is vital in helping it to analyse it closely. The child sort of reaches out into the world in the same way enjambment makes the line reach out beyond its own limits. So even the most commonplace and banal instances of form, like the couplet or the quatrain, can produce meaning in a range of different ways. And let's turn now to another of the forms that I've flashed up earlier. And it's this one used by Sylvia Plath in Morning Song. This is not only a different form, but it also generates a different relationship between content and the framework in which it's cast. Plath is actually quite a good author to study from the point of view of form. Despite her popular, even critical reputation as a kind of untamed, elemental writer, producing wild expressionistic outcries, in Victor Howe's words, her poetry is in fact highly accomplished at a technical level, carefully selecting and manipulating its forms. As Eileen Aird says, in Sylvia Plath's poetry the emphasis is on structure and craftsmanship rather than statement. To appreciate this, it's worth looking at Morning Song in full. So the poem reads, "Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bold cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue in a drafty museum. Your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen. A far sea moves in my ear. One cry and I stumble from bed, cow-heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons. Okay, so although this is an unrhymed poem, the form that Plath is using here is known as the tercet, in that each stanza is divided neatly into 3 lines. And the tercet itself is quite a loaded form to use, since, unlike the quatrain or the couplet, it is associated with one specific context above all others. The most famous writer of tercets is the 14th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri, whose Divine Comedy, including the famous Inferno sequence, recounts a journey through hell, purgatory and heaven in brisk 3-line stanzas. It's a 3-stage journey. The 3 lines used throughout reflect the process. And no doubt Plath is evoking Dante by drawing on this form, perhaps suggesting that birth is a comparable journey. But what the tercet also does, that couplets or quatrains can't do, is suggest the idea of a centre, with its groups of odd-numbered lines. And sure enough, the text has a fairly clear central point, the first line of the 3rd stanza, which not only begins the midsection of the poem, but attracts attention in its blunt, assertive statement, "I'm no more your mother." This is not only shocking in its literal sense, but it stands in contrast to the more directly descriptive stanzas that precede it. With their lengthy, dreamily meandering lines, it shifts in both mood and sentence structure into a punchy, reflective announcement. It's the first time the speaker has proclaimed her own presence as a speaking I. So the temptation in this case is to see this slightly dispiriting claim, this disavowal of motherhood and the child itself, as the key to the text as the whole, the point at which Plath spells out clearly what the text is about. However, the way that the stanzas fit together in the poem, the relationships set up between them, produce something of a different effect. If we look at the way that the poem is put together, you'll notice that the stanzas contain a series of similar objects. Collectively, these form a kind of thread in the poem, linking its sections together with a common theme, distributed systematically throughout the text. In the first stanza, the watch is clearly the dominant symbol. In the second, the word magnifying suggests a magnifying glass. In the third, a mirror is mentioned. In the fourth, we have flat pink roses. In the fifth, a cat's mouth. And finally, the conclusive word and image of balloons. Of course, these symbols all share one common similarity. They all have the same circular shape. Circles seem to be a continual presence throughout the poem, emphasised by the regular occurrence in each tercet. In fact, the structure of the entire poem itself echoes this circularity. The second vowel and consonant of balloons brings us back to love in the first line again. And this notion of circularity in relation to childbirth begins to create a rather different undercurrent in the text. The idea of the narrator's experience as simply being part of a larger system, a cycle of births and deaths that she and her son are equally part of. So she's perhaps not renouncing the child, but seeing it as part of a larger process. And she is no longer a mother than the cloud, because in fact the entire system around them envelops both of them. When we look at the symbols again, this is only underscored. From the first 3 to the last, there's a clear movement from cold, mechanical objects that are merely seen, a watch that is looked at, a mirror that's looked into, a magnifying glass that's looked through, to objects that are more tactile and pleasurable. They're there to be played with, touched and stroked or smelt, the cat, the roses, the balloon. The way that the objects are littered through the poem also charts a gradual progression through distance, isolation, separation, towards contact, in the same way that the mother herself responds to the child. So the poem, when we start to look at these meanings, is not one of despair at all, but of gradual acceptance, not only of the child, but of his and the narrator's place in the larger, interminable cycle and system of nature. And it's the form of the poem, its division into these neat stanzas, each equipped with its own circular object and its own circular form, that carry this meaning, that push it home. What the Plath piece shows then is not merely how the tercet works, but how form can complicate and even contradict the surface meaning expressed in a poem. Plath's use of the tercet form proposes two different sets of meanings simultaneously. It serves to direct us towards the centre of the text, but also to replace that stark statement we find there with a more complex set of ideas. It adds a new, quite different dimension to the poem. So the poem lends itself well to the critical position proposed by Cleanth Brooks, showing that the elements of the poem are related to each other as the blossoms are related to each other on the parts of a growing plant. As form and content work in combination to generate meanings that singly they don't convey. So finally then, to wrap this up, what all this tells us is that form is not it doesn't kill a poem. Thinking about form does not end up reducing it to a skeleton. Form is, if anything, the kind of dynamic element of a poem. The shifts in rhyme scheme or metre, the sustaining a particular form, actually end up producing a lot of the meaning of a poem, doing a lot of that heavy lifting in terms of expression. These are the things we need to kind of look for. Finally, form is the kind of dynamic element of poetry. Its meanings are not static. They emerge out of the tensions and the relationships between these elements that form sets into play. Thank you for listening.